I'm Olof Mathé, and I would like to talk about artists and hackers and hackers as artists. And I'll do that from a very, very personal vantage point of my own practice, dealing a lot with notions of identity and presence, and I'll also talk about it in the context of Art Hack Day, which is an event I organize that brings together artists and hackers to create a flash exhibit. So while we get set up, just a couple of things on the topic of art and hacking, because there's so much to be said, right? Just a couple of things I won't talk about. I won't talk about the genesis of the word hacking. I won't talk about the Railroad Club at MIT. I won't talk about Eric Raymond's seminal book, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which deals a lot with the reputation economy in hacking and why hacking and open source works the way it works. I'm not going to talk about Paul Graham's book, Hackers and Painters, Paul Graham being now a very well-known VC who started as a technologist. His book being kind of one of the main sources whereby a lot of technologists today discover that technology is very, very closely related to art. And lastly, I won't talk about the kind of, or polemicize the recent trend in the wake of Snowden or Julian Assange, whereby artists rebrand themselves as hackers. What I will do, though, is just share a very personal story of how I got started with my own practice, and then talk a little bit about Art Hack Day and what I think that means for kind of artistic production hacking and what art and technology can learn from each other. So very, very briefly about how I got started with my own practice. And I'll share a performance I did 4.5 years ago. And the very genesis of this performance started at CES. I don't know if you know what CES is, but it's the biggest consumer electronics show in the world. It takes place in Vegas, and it's literally incredible in that you cannot believe that that thing actually happens. You still have roughly 100,000 middle-aged men who all descend into the same conference center to check out the latest consumer electronics, half of which never reach market. But it's really interesting in that you see a lot of crazy stuff. As I mentioned, part of it never reaches the market. And one of the things when I was there 4.5 years ago was that I saw this thing, which is an AnyBot. And it's kind of a remote presence robot. I'm sure it looks much cooler now than it did back then. But back then, it was the newest thing I knew existed. So I went in and investigated this thing closely because I'm really into notions of identity and remote presence. And I was kind of shocked at this device and how expensive it was, and in my mind, how incredibly over-engineered it was. So if you look at it, it's on 2 wheels, but somehow it stands upright. So some incredible mechanical engineering and probably computer science went into making this thing actually work. And I was just like, why wouldn't you just take a remote-controlled car, an iPad, which had just come out back then, and put it on the remote-controlled car? And there you have your remote presence robot for, $500 instead of 15,000, which is what these AnyBots went for. So I was really, really proud of this, what I perceived as, my stroke of genius. And I went and spoke about it to a German artist friend who was really into biohacking. And he was less convinced about the artistic merit of that, probably on very fair grounds. And since he was big into biohacking, he was like, you know what? I think you should just deal with rats. Do lab rats and use an iPhone and graft iPhones into the rat's eyes. That's a great remote presence robot. And I was like, this is dystopic beyond belief. But I still thought the idea had some merit. The problem, of course, with his proposal was that it would take absolutely forever to complete, to actually graft these iPhones into the rat's eyes. So instead, I took out what then was an iPhone 3, which was actually kind of an old iPhone even back then, and drew this very, very simple sketch for my version of a remote presence robot, where I thought that I would simply use this notion, take his idea of having iPhones as eyes, replace my eyes by the iPhones, and have other people dial in and kind of take over me as a person as I walked around. And I would do something to kind of like dress this up as a mask or something like that. So I did this really ugly sketch and showed it to a couple of artist friends and technologist friends, and everyone was unanimous that it was an absolutely terrible idea. So I paused on it for a little bit. And then a couple of months later, I found myself at a different conference, again for work, South by Southwest. And if you've ever been, you might have found yourself kind of understimulated and bored. And I kind of got a little bit bored during the conference, so I decided, hey, I'm just going to do this and see how it works out. So I went to a bunch of dollar stores and started to try to kind of figure out how I could create this remote presence robot, and started to try on waste baskets for structural support. So I tried on one, then a different one, different texture here, as you can see. I also tried lampshades, and unfortunately, it was really hard to take pictures with your phone and get the right focus. So I managed actually to find someone else who would put on baskets on his head for me to see what it would look like. And we tried on various different kinds of baskets just to get proper structural support. And finally, I found the right basket and started to assemble this. And this is what my remote presence robot finally turned out as when I had people dialing in to it. And here I'm just walking around at South by Southwest doing, what I was supposed to do for work. With people dialing in to my eyes and seeing what I see, but obviously being unable to kind of control me. And we also did another version of this whereby, since the Wi-Fi connection was flaky at some points, we actually changed to front-facing camera recording just as a different experiment, which created an entirely different set of social reactions to it. So that was kind of a very, very quick social exploration in remote presence. And the reception for this was incredibly warm, which is always a little bit of a coin toss when you do something where you cover your face, whether people are going to be freaked out or whether they're going to approach you. In this case, everyone was approaching me, and kind of the most common question was, why are you doing this? What kind of cause are you advancing? And since there was at South by Southwest, people also asked, which brand is this for? Which I thought was both flattering and terrifying at the same time. So to me, anyhow, I had just done it, obviously, to kind of spur a reflection around remote presence and kind of just a little bit be arty about it. And when I did afterwards, when I kind of consolidated this as kind of just a quick speed project or, a hack or an artistic experiment, I kind of just did a time budget to figure out how much time did this actually take to do. And when I did it, it dawned upon me that I had spent less than 24 hours end to end, from idea generation to actually doing the performance. And as you can see, a large part of the time was actually spent finding the right wastebasket as structural support. Turned into the trickiest thing. And it dawned upon me then that this was actually a lot like a hackathon, except that I'd kind of done it on my own, and it would be really nice to do this with other people. Now, of course, back then and still today, hacking and hackathons are kind of under assault conceptually by a lot of different parties, both in kind of art critique as kind of a very capitalist mode of production, and then on the corporate side, whereby corporate interests have kind of taken over the original notion of hacking and kind of subverted it into, a recruiting event that's highly competitive and filled with prizes, rather than just being about, the joy of creation and kind of subverting a system. This picture being from Facebook's old campus, just to exemplify the kind of corruption that the word has faced, which I think it's actually always faced ever since its inception. So with a couple of other artists and hackers, we banded together and said, hey, it would be really nice to do something like this together to kind of try to reinstate the original meaning of the word hacking, if such meaning ever existed. And we started this event called Art Hack Day, where we get together a bunch of hackers whose medium is art and artists whose medium is tech, and we create an exhibit together in 48 hours in an art space from scratch. And this exhibit always has a theme that's both artistically, politically, and technologically relevant. So the last theme on the top of the list was deluge, to try to explore whether artists and technologists actually can have anything to say with regards to climate change, which we'll see towards the end is definitely the case. And this exhibit just lasts one evening, which kind of removes a lot of the pressure around, creating something awesome. I hope my prior art hack kind of lowered the bar of your expectations of what would come out, and also kind of removes a lot of the potential competitiveness that can exist. So When we do Art Hack Days, we do it for kind of two reasons, because there are two core notions that we really want to champion, and two core notions that we think are like really at the intersection of art and technology. And they're the notions of radical collaboration and the notion of expressiveness. And I'd like to dive into these two notions and show you a couple of artworks that have come out of Art Hack Day that really embody these two notions. So firstly, I think arguably radical collaboration is something that's very, very core to technology and open source being a reputation economy that's kind of, arguably blissfully outside of the real world economy, which just breeds an entirely different level of collaboration. And then, of course, what art to a large extent brings to technology is expressiveness in a much deeper sense than we typically have when we talk about expressiveness in technology. So firstly, let's just talk a little bit about radical collaboration in the context of hackery, bringing it to art, and in the context of Art Hack Day. So obviously in an Art Hack Day, people come together who might not ever have worked together. So that's, in one way, the type of radical collaboration you get. But you also get it in the kind of pure hacking sense, where authorship can be incredibly hard to determine just because so many people have contributed to a work at one moment in time. And furthermore, this notion stretches even further out because it's even collaborating with the audience in a very, very deep sense, where the audience might not just be participating in the artwork, but where the audience might actually be putting themselves at risk. So I'll show you an example of one of these artworks that kind of embody radical collaboration and where the audience puts itself at risk. And that's a work I did with Shampori Rith and Dean Hunt when we were just starting to work together, called Pantheon. And Pantheon is a Chrome extension that lets you swap your online identity with other people who also have that same extension. So it's actually an incredibly scary extension, because as you use it and as you live this artwork as an audience, you are taking the online identity of someone else, and someone else is also taking your identity. The way this piece works, and it's a little bit hard to show as a slideshow, but every time you open a new tab, you will open it as another person who also has the Chrome extension. So you might open it, in this case, logged into someone else, personal information on their account. This account just happens to be the New York Times. Or you might log into actually their online bank or their Facebook account. And this works via cookie sharing, which is kind of the fundamental infrastructure of the web. So while you have kind of complete control over someone else's online identity, someone else who also has the extension has control over your online identity. So it's a very, very weird game of like cat and mouse that engages the audience in this like collaborative sense very, very deeply. And this was for the Art Hack Day that was themed God mode. So obviously here you kind of, through the extension, you get God mode over someone else's identity for a brief moment of time. So it's a very kind of like bizarre reflection on power. And the other work I'd just like to share with regards to radical collaboration in the context of Art Hack Day was the world's first digital artist auction. So this was a work that we created probably like 10 people overall involved in the complete production of this performance. And it was, what happened was that 4 digital artists sold their Facebook profiles in an online auction to the highest bidder. So if you aren't aware of this, there's actually a giant black market online where people try to acquire fake identities for various purposes, both legitimate and non-legitimate. And it's kind of a pun on both the fact that it's really hard to make a living as an artist because the art economy is very dire, and the fact that there are all these companies that are actually making money off of our digital identities. We did a performance whereby these, well, actually 5 artists sold their identities online. So not only was it a group of people who had never worked together that came together to collaborate, but also was like deeply collaborative in the sense they were actually giving up part of their identities to the audience that then bought their profiles. So that's a little bit on the notion of radical collaboration and how that can get created in this like very, very constrained circumstance that is Art Hack Day. So to kind of round off and talk a little bit about expressiveness, which obviously is kind of what art brings to hackery in a much deeper sense than I think most hackers would admit. typically when we talk about expressiveness in technology or in programming, right, it's in this almost esoteric sense of a programming language being beautiful or very expressive, or mathematics being very concise here, Euler's identity and expressive. But in my mind, that's a very kind of like esoteric notion of expressiveness in technology. And of course, in the context of this conference and this audience, we all use technology as a real tool to express ourselves. So it's also, if you think about how technology is often taught, it's taught in a very utilitarian way, where there's always kind of a utilitarian end goal that isn't always related to just expressing ourselves as humans. So an example of an artwork that really, really embodies the expressiveness of technology is this piece called Iconoclashes, which came from the God Mode themed Art Hack Day. And this was actually on really to radical collaboration to 3 people who had never worked together: graphic designer, artist Clement Valla, a photographer Eric Berglin, and a programmer Jonathan Dayan, who came together and made these algorithmic mashups of iconography from the Met. And called it Iconoclashes, and used technology to kind of create these new artifacts that in a way kind of comment on our shared human heritage. So that's one of them. And then another iconoclash kind of would want someone to 3D print these if 3D printers ever get that good. And to round up on the expressiveness and using technology to express something, I mentioned the last theme was deluge, whereby we commented on kind of climate change. And I personally was very skeptical whether anything would come out of the theme on climate change with regards to art and technology, because you can kind of feel powerless, both as an artist and as a hacker, dealing with such a problem of the commons. And this was a very clever work that came out of it. Which was called the IPCC by Tega Brain, and she worked with Sam Levine on this work, where they took the IPCC report, which is basically a summary of the scientific knowledge and political consensus, quote unquote, on climate change, and replaced the word climate change by capitalism in all of their reports and in the videos as well, and printed it out and exhibited it. And obviously, it just generated a ton of puns, as you can see here, mitigation of capitalism on the Intergovernmental Panel on Capitalism, which also reads, actually, if you read it, as one of the most cogent critiques of capitalism, incidentally, that you could think of. And to round up, because actually the IPCC got the Nobel Prize for its work on climate change in 2007. So kind of a golden comment from there was, action is necessary now before capitalism moves beyond man control, which obviously in the original was climate change, and just highlights how clever the commentary is on, climate change being this problem of the commons, and how capitalism is kind of the underlying problem of climate change that's hard to address. So with that, I'd round up on the notion of artists as hackers. Thank you.